Good morning. Welcome to the next episode of The Professor and the CEO, which today we are talking about containing a crisis. I'm Ben Gillam, CEO of ThirdWay, and just a quick reminder of why we're doing this. Having run a business for 10 years now, I found at times you can become incredibly insular when you're just thinking about the business and what you're going through. And some of the best advice I've had and some of the best methods for getting through crisis and challenge has been sort of looking outside of my box and my sphere and speaking to people like Rachel, who introduced herself shortly, and picking their brains about in the world of academia and the way they look at crisis and the way they've studied crisis. And we just thought this would be such a great series to do for people who are interested in business and business leaders to tap into, to just see how on the ground experience of running a business in a crisis is, with loads of methods and loads of research that you can tap into along the way. So that's the intro from me. Over to you, Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Doern, and I'm a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, University of London. And my research tends to focus on entrepreneurship in crises. And so I look at crisis management, so how businesses and entrepreneurs prepare for a crisis, how they limit and localize the effects of such, how they recover, and how they feed that all back into that cycle, that process later on, and also how businesses and entrepreneurs can be more resilient. So resilience is all about bouncing back from a particular event, from a crisis. So today, as Ben mentioned, we're going to talk about crisis containment and recovery. So we're going to look at some strategies that businesses use in times of crisis. And in the latter case, we're not trying to be prescriptive. We're just trying to share with you some of the strategies or activities that companies have used. And just to suggest before we start that we have a Q&A function as well at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, please type them into the box there, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to get to those. So thank you very much. Or if you have any comments as well, and we'll read those out. So in relation to crisis containment, so that crisis containment usually happens in the emergency phase of a crisis, so immediately thereafter. So think in terms of the pandemic, COVID-19, just going into the lockdown period in the first few weeks thereafter. So it tends to precede recovery, this kind of containment period, and really tends to focus on all those measures that individuals and organizations take to prevent unwanted outcomes following an unexpected event. So it might include things like assessing the nature and extent of the damages incurred. It might include mobilizing resources or seeing what resources are available, and also communicating what's happening for the business and what steps the business is taking to their stakeholders effectively. So communicating to employees, to customers, to suppliers, and others. So let's take the first example. So assessing the nature and extent of the damages. So the first part of crisis containment. So at this stage, a company might start thinking about what is the scale of this crisis exactly. So COVID-19 is just an example of one kind of crisis. And as we know, it's taking place on a very global scale. But if we think about other kinds of crises, even related crises like SARS in 2003, which affected certain countries or even certain cities, like in the former case, China and Singapore, in the latter case, Hanoi and Toronto and Hong Kong and other places. So those effects were much more localized. The infection didn't spread as rapidly as it has done with COVID-19. So what is the scale of the crisis? Is it happening globally, locally, or is it happening just organizationally? So is it happening just to us? Has there been a fire? Has there been a technical default or the like? So what is the scale of the crisis? And also, are other people in the sector, in my supply chain, are they affected? And within the organization as well, thinking about what sort of areas of the organization have been impacted, and what are the nature of the damages, or what is the nature of the damage in particular? Is it the liquidity of the business that's suffering? Is it a cash flow problem, or what? So I'd like to turn to Ben now to ask him.
At the outset, the biggest concern with the crisis of the pandemic was cash flow. It's what on earth is going to happen to our cash flow. We work on projects. Our projects, we get paid based upon percentage of completion. And what we couldn't be sure of was were we going to be able to operationally deliver our projects? Was the government going to enable our operatives to operate, to deliver? And if they weren't, that would have made like a real dent into our cash flow. And then would have had to have looked at, okay, we've got quite a bit of retained profit. How much of that do we eke out against? Do we go to external sources, banks, and get loans to help cover this shortfall that we have? So that was definitely the sort of the first concern, the first sort of area that we really focused on. And it was a really challenging time because there wasn't any clarity from government, and this isn't necessarily a criticism because it all happened so fast, as to what was allowed to continue and what wasn't. And across the sector, there was no consensus either. So you had some companies actually ceasing to continue their projects and others continuing. And it became not a question necessarily of just the delivery piece and honouring contracts. There was a moral piece. Are we putting people at risk? Are we putting people at danger? What type of company are we? So there was a lot of things to consider. But as soon as we could get control of that piece and the cash flow and build a runway for the future, it enabled us to sort of approach other aspects of the crisis, of which in this pandemic and the economic crisis that's followed, there's been many.
Okay, great, thank you. So exactly, so crisis containment, again, just to suggest, is all about preventing unwanted outcomes. It's about limiting the negative consequences of a crisis. So the first stage is about thinking about the nature and extent of damages, as Ben mentioned, some examples in terms of what he was thinking about in relation to his business. But another thing, another step in the crisis containment process is all about mobilizing resources, as Ben alluded to as well. So this is thinking about who will mobilize the resources within the organization and also what kinds of resources need to be mobilized. So if we think about larger businesses or even slightly larger SMEs, a lot of these businesses who focus on risk assessments and this kind of contingency planning as the norm, this would fall into the remit of the crisis management team, these kinds of activities in terms of mobilizing resources. But for a very small business, for an individual owner manager, these kinds of activities might be under the responsibility of one individual or two individuals. And really, the most important thing is not only in terms of who has to make these kinds of decisions, but in terms of where decision-making flows. So it doesn't necessarily have to flow from the top to the bottom or even from the bottom to the top. The point is that whoever has expertise should be best positioned to address some of these issues, to think about what are the resources we need to mobilize and how. So what tends to happen in crisis situations, especially in these larger organizations, is that these informal networks tend to form within organizations, but also, as Ben, as you mentioned at the beginning, you might reach out to people outside of your organization as well to resolve a particular problem. So these teams self-organize, resolve the problem, and then they disband. So to give you an example from my own industry, so in relation to higher education, so universities recently went through this period of trying to figure out how to enable students to finish their final year exams, right? So normally this is a process where people come in and they sit in these very large rooms next to other students, but in an environment where social distancing is a big issue, we can't do this. So we had to move these kinds of exams to an online situation where we were doing multiple choice questions and otherwise, but in a very timed and remote capacity. So it wasn't enough to have module conveners do this, but we also had to involve people who are speaking a lot with the students, like program directors, but also people responsible for students with disabilities, for student learning, student experience, and also people with technical experience. So all these people had to come together to resolve this issue of how do we deal with exams now? And once that situation was monitored and completed, we all disbanded and went about other things. So that's an example of mobilizing resources. So it shouldn't be about hierarchy per se, regardless of the size of the business. It should actually be about who has expertise to kind of address these problems. And then the other issue with mobilizing resources is what kinds of resources do we need to mobilize? And again, can we get these resources, knowledge resources or otherwise, from within the business, or do we have to go outside of the business? So do we need to lean on our friends and family members for support, emotional, practical, financial, or otherwise? Do we need to go to our communities and our customers and our local businesses, other local businesses? Do we need to turn to professional associations or even councils? So who can offer us support? So in the London riots, for instance, 22 of the 32 boroughs businesses in those boroughs were affected. And some councils, but not all, actually provided businesses affected by that particular crisis with one-off payments or bridging loans. So that was a form of resource, a kind of resource that those businesses could access, but not all businesses had access to such. And similarly, as you implied earlier, in the case of government supports, there has been a huge stimulus package, but not everybody is eligible for that support, unfortunately. So the grants are only for specific businesses, usually smaller ones. and not everybody wants to take on external or outside debt. So these are challenges. So it's thinking about what is realistic and what is not. And if that's not an option for me, where else can I mobilize resources? So Ben, in your case, maybe you could just elaborate.
Yes, it's interesting, like reflecting back. I think CEOs, and I've not come from the traditional route of like perhaps join a business, go through the ranks, go from COO to CEO. I started a business and sort of, you have to learn on your feet, and from various business books and pieces of advice you give. I think it felt, a little bit like uncertain of what to do and where to go. And not in a sort of crippling sense, but just, it was all very new. And as you say, there wasn't sort of ever a thought in our business to have a specific crisis management team who were planning for these types of scenarios. And as we touched on before, it wasn't that we didn't know what to do. It's just we'd never spent any time thinking about what we would do if a crisis came. So very much at first, it was exactly as you said, it was like, who do we need to solve the problems that we have internally? Who are the right people in the rooms? And one of the upsides of the crisis I found is immediately people could park, I'm going to call it ego, but like the emotional attachment to a title, or the emotional attachment to wanting to be in the room, to being focused on what's the job in hand. We can lose the pleasantries and just get to the point, focus, set a plan, and leave the room with a plan. So internally, we were able to do that very quickly. And I think we're lucky as a business that we've got like a broad range of skill sets just naturally from what we do in the business. So we've got creative and graphics and marketing who could deal with the messaging and get that out to people and also help clients, but also project managers, really sort of methodical and analytical people who could look at the problem. But we had to go outside, and increasingly we've had to go broader and broader in external support, in finding consultants who are specialists in this and advising us in certain areas, in speaking to banks and saying, well, what is available from the government to a business like us, which, we're a fairly large business, but not institutional. Yeah. So that was very challenging, seeing that actually there's nothing specific for us. Like, how do we go about that? And it's actually been a really encouraging time in sort of business community that other business leaders I know, whether in our industry or not, have been great at just sort of talking through their own experiences and saying what was good, what was bad, what's helped, what hasn't. And really, it's just been a case of taking different bits of the jigsaw, pulling it all together, and like realizing there was a heck of a lot of support out there. Now we know what the picture is. Now we know what expertise are there. We can mobilize and push them in the right directions. So sorry, that was a really broad answer.
No.
I think it perhaps shows that as a business leader, like, you don't always know the answer, but you've got to go out and be open enough to ask people internally and externally, like, who have expertise, get their advice, get their opinions, pull it together and unashamedly execute on it. And if you've got to pivot and go again.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, we're speaking at a time when COVID-19 is very much still apparent. So it's an evolving situation. So it's not like we did this and it's over and done with, and now we're moving on to the next stage. I think this is something to even finish this session with, by saying that we should always revisit what we're doing and reflect on such, and think about how can it be done differently or better.
Can I just pick up on that? It's what's been like particularly interesting with this crisis is, this is the second real crisis I've worked through, 2008. So the great financial crisis being the first. What's been really interesting with this is there's so many different crises that have just actually attacked each other. We've got a health crisis that's become an economic crisis that is now becoming perhaps there's also been a health crisis. There's perhaps a mental health crisis in terms of anxiety for people returning to work, getting back on public transport. We could be looking at in our own industry a real estate crisis, and there's unquestionably a crisis of confidence for consumers. So what's been particularly challenging is, as you're coming out of one crisis, you need to be aware that you're moving into the next, and 40%, 30% of the contingency plan you've done, you don't necessarily need to bin, but you need to look at and go again and edit and modify. And I'm sure I'm not alone in sort of finding that incredibly challenging in this period.
Yeah, absolutely. So reflecting on this containment sort of period that we're going through, this essentially this emergency phase. So as I mentioned, it's thinking about what's the scale of the crisis, and as you suggest, there are many crises going on at the same time, the scope of such, and the nature and extent of the damages for one specific business, and then also reflecting on what kinds of resources do we need to mobilize, and who's going to be responsible for such? How do we go about that? And then the third phase is really thinking about communicating what's happening to stakeholder groups. So thinking about, and when I say stakeholders, I'm of course referring to employees and clients or customers and suppliers and lenders and so on and so forth. But communicating to them, whether it's COVID-19 or something else, another kind of crisis, what's happened, how has it affected your business, and how might it affect them? And in particular, and importantly, what corrective actions are you taking as a business to resolve the situation? So in the case of the pandemic, it might include sort of saying, look, in light of the current situation and restrictions on social distancing, the implications are that my product or service line is changing as a result. And these are the things that we're doing, or my earnings have been affected as a result. And these might be the implications for you. And in terms of thinking about how to communicate those kinds of messages to these different stakeholders, of course, social media is one way to do so as it relates to clients or otherwise, but also using social media as a way to gauge how you are performing, what you're doing, and what members of the public sort of think of that, and to use that as information to adjust, to be flexible in terms of revisiting what's working and what's not. And then also in terms of your staff, sort of setting up opportunities to speak to them. I know all businesses are doing this now pretty much. A lot of them remotely, of course, using Microsoft Teams or Zoom or what have you, to set up these kind of one-to-one or group meetings to say to staff, this is what's happening, to update them, but also to suggest that, their voice is important, to solicit feedback from them. But most importantly, at this stage of containment, it's also about reassuring people that actually, what's happening isn't great, but we are taking steps to the best of our ability to try to resolve the situation. We're going to keep you up to date with that. So with regards to that.
Yeah, I mean, our core focus really has been around our staff. Our comms with our clients has been fairly standard, because it's like project by project, you're having sort of individual interaction on a fairly sort of daily, if not weekly basis. So the comms, although it's taken perhaps a different note, you're working with them and you're updating them. There's been no real delay in our project work, and similarly for our supply chain. But with the staff, I think the point you make there is key. It is about reassuring. It's about being as transparent as possible. And I think also not being afraid to say things are changing. Like, this is the direction we're going, we're keeping you updated, but it's difficult to give guarantees. And one of the things we were talking about with our exec team yesterday was the importance of not just consistency of message, but repetition of message. You have to consistently, but also repetitively share the message so that the company becomes awash with it, because it doesn't always land with people. Particularly when people are anxious, they hang on one word and perhaps miss the context of what you're saying. So what we're increasingly working really hard at is comms with the management team, making it crystal clear to them what the business is doing and why, and the comfort and the assurance we can give, and then pushing it down continually to the team and hoping that it lands. So that's sort of really been the key focus. I think to the outside world, it's really interesting. I've become like super cynical of some of the social media platforms that businesses promote themselves on. And really just because it's felt to me like a lot of people feel they have to say something, and it's just contributing noise. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I know it's important for brands to get themselves out there. I just think what's really important in a crisis is to have real meaning and real gravity to what you're saying, and understand the impact it has on people who might just sort of pick it up. And I think that's something I actually think we've done quite well, but it's something I love almost to come out of this crisis, businesses to look at what they did, what they said, say, was it just noise, or did we actually give ourselves time to think about it, speak to our clients, speak to our supply chain, and give really meaningful insights to actually contribute to the business community to come out of the crisis.
Right. So we talked a little bit about containment and all the different, or some examples of aspects of containment. And then I think what follows from that is recovery, ultimately, although these things can take place in tandem, of course. But recovery is really about reflecting on those kinds of activities or strategies that businesses and organizations are taking or utilizing to bring the business back to normal, or to some position of relative stability, let's say. And And this often includes these dual processes of minimizing costs on the one hand, but also generating revenue on the other. So thinking about, in the former case, reducing expenses incurred, all the expenses incurred in running a business. So just to give you a few examples from other studies, I mentioned SARS before, and SARS I think is an interesting case because it took place in 2003, and as I mentioned, it was largely contained to certain countries and even certain cities, but it's got some similarities to COVID-19 in the sense that it's transmitted through airborne water particles, and also presents itself or can present itself as an atypical form of pneumonia. So it's interesting to look back at some of that research and what people found in terms of what companies at that time were actually doing. And so there's some research to suggest that, similar to today, that the hospitality industry, of course, and leisure and tourism, these were industries that were all very much affected by that time in 2003. So in Hong Kong, for instance, restaurants there, in order to cope during that time to recover, they minimize costs by doing things like reducing advertising and promotion expenditures. They tried to reduce factory inputs, so they turned to cheaper ingredients to try to save money that way. They also went to staff, asking staff to take pay cuts or unpaid leave. But also hotels did similar things in Singapore. So hotels were very much affected, as you can imagine. So their tourism trade, international tourism, sort of, went to a screeching halt. And so they did those things as well, but also hotels in some cases, closed off entire wings or floors to save the cost of utilities or labor inputs in relation to such. And in both cases, companies, went to the government and lobbied for more support and took advantage of tax breaks and reduced charges on utilities and the like. And also, if you look at research on, for instance, the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, we can see some similar strategies by companies affected over that time in the UK and New Zealand and elsewhere. So again, these strategies of reducing advertising and promotion expenditures, or initiating sort of pay freezes or asking people to take unpaid leave, or because in the UK, for instance, now we have the furlough scheme that hasn't so far been necessary. But this kind of rationalization of employees tended to take place in New Zealand, for instance. And also relying on unpaid family labor was another strategy that some companies used, reducing the range of products and services. That was another example. And people started to take on more external debt as well, in the form of loans or relying on personal savings, or even selling personal assets. So these are just some examples of things that people did. But what's interesting about some of that research is that the suggestion is that companies who were more vulnerable or resilient as a result of the crisis or going into the crisis tended to have different strategies. So even in New Zealand, companies that were less vulnerable, so for instance, hadn't been severely affected by the crisis because of the sector perhaps they were in, or these were also businesses that had less growth potential, for instance, they would follow those strategies. The ones that were vulnerable would follow the strategies I mentioned prior, but the ones who were less vulnerable and more resilient, instead of focusing on employee rationalization, were actually hiring employees. They were actually investing in equipment, and they were actually looking for other ways to sell more to existing customers. So these are almost examples more so of revenue generating strategies. And I think the latter is really interesting because I think that's something that some businesses are trying to do now in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, we don't want to be prescriptive, but something that people even tuning in might consider. Because I can even think about, sitting here in Southeast London, some of my local businesses, like a local beer and wine shop, who have actually changed what they've done in the sense that they're still selling those products, but they've actually become a local grocers as well. So they're thinking the medium term, how can we best serve the local community? So these are different examples, in particular of cost minimization strategies, but then moving on into revenue generating ones as well, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But Ben,
I think for most businesses who are basically in London, your biggest cost is your staff. Like that's the reality. Like if I think about overhead base, like 80, maybe 90% of it is attributed to staff, whether that's salaries and the adults. So one of the scariest things about when this crisis came was, you're looking at it as a business owner and saying, well, if I need to reduce costs significantly, nothing else moves the dial. It's only staff. So that's why the furlough scheme has been excellent for us and for many others, is because it just enabled us to control cost reduction. And we didn't have to do anything drastic. we could actually be really flexible with the furlough scheme with how we did that. And it just enabled us to actually make really considered decisions as opposed to quick decisions. And I think it's been a fantastic scheme for that. And I can say that as sort of both a business owner and a taxpayer. I feel like the balance of that has been really, really excellent and really helped this business and others. I find it's really fascinating as you talk about recovery. It's just multi-pronged, isn't it, recovery? Like, it's not just about bunkering down and saying, hey, we've got to cut our cost base and hopefully come out of this, because you're putting the blinkers on if you're doing that, and you're not looking and asking the question, like, has the world fundamentally changed as a result of this crisis? And like, certainly in my industry, I think it has. I think there are fundamental changes that arguably were on the way, but are now going to be fully in swing. So if we thought for 1 minute that we could take the same products and the same process that we had before the crisis and think the tap's just going to turn back on afterwards, we'd been very, very foolish. So part of the recovery for us is actually like upskilling ourselves, changing some of what we do to make sure we're ready for what comes. And I think like recovery has to be multi-pronged. Otherwise, you're going to fall over. No one wants to be the business that survives COVID-19, but then fails in the economy that follows. Like, you need to take a broader approach to it.
Exactly. And I just want to say a few words about revenue generation as well. So of course, that's all about strategies and activities initiated to bring money into the business. And I've already given some examples of what that might entail, but it's also, instead of, if you think about reducing advertising and promotional expenditures, in some cases, it could be about increasing those activities. It could be about changing aspects of the marketing mix, also changing the perceived quality of your products and services, so that can help. And I see a strategy common to what's happening now, but also in previous studies in relation to offering discounts for individuals as well. So any kind of technique to try to pull more people in. And when I reflect back on some of the research done on SARS, again, in hotels in Singapore, this was something they did. So because their international tourism trade was very much affected, they started turning to locals, to residents, and saying, well, maybe we can offer discounted rooms and amenities to this particular group as well. So I think that was useful. Also, another thing that in the case of SARS, some companies did, restaurants, but also hotels and otherwise, is they used it as an opportunity. The epidemic used it as an opportunity to change their social image by donating to community funds and the like. And I see this happening now a little bit as well with the COVID-19. So there's some examples of breweries and distilleries sort of saying, we're using this time to go more green. And I think that's interesting, and potentially another strategy that businesses can use as well. So these are all examples, but also I wanted to mention that there are a lot of restrictions in place, as we all know, in terms of COVID-19, in terms of getting businesses, all different kinds of businesses up and running again. So some people are required to wear masks or create social distancing measures or otherwise. But this was also the case with SARS in the places I've mentioned. And a lot of the companies affected by that used that as a marketing tool to create these kind of hygiene ambassadors, people who would greet you at restaurants or hotels or otherwise, taking your temperature, giving you antibacterial wipes and the like, or getting you to fill in health declaration forms, or in the case of the tourism trade, setting up their own hygiene awards effectively. So if you were the recipient of one of these awards, it sort of declared in the public eye that you were a safe place to be. So I think that's an interesting strategy that some companies are using. And I see that happening now in a couple of instances as well. So I don't know if you saw it, Ben, but there was a tweet that went viral recently about a secondhand clothing store that had put up a sandwich board because they were, with a note to all customers, because they were tired of explaining to people why it was important to wear a mask while people came to the shop. So instead of doing so, they just said on the sandwich board, look, if you come in, you have to wear a mask. And if you don't, then we'll sell your dead grandmother's clothes at another time. So it was quite a provocative message, but it generated loads of publicity for them. And I think some of these strategies can be effective. But as you suggest, it's hard to sort of tease away or to discern the authentic from maybe the less authentic messages. But I think even in the short term, some of these strategies can be useful. So using that decreased physical risk tagline as another sort of promotional tool in conjunction with some of these other things to generate revenue and to signal to people that, it's a safe place to be. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you want to share with us maybe some other activities that you're doing in terms of generating revenue at this time for your business.
I think that the key piece for revenue generation is knowing your client. I can't forget the particular guy's name who wrote the book. His Moments of Truth. He was the CEO of a Scandinavian Airlines short book that's sort of his sort of take on his career. And the chapter that really stood out to me in that book was like knowing your client. What he put a high premium on was understanding exactly who his client was and what problems they faced as individuals. And I think that all of our strategies, all of our marketing is about, it starts there. It's like, who is our client? What are the particular troubles they're having in COVID-19? How can we help answer those questions? And if our strategies work back from there, because if we can't answer those questions, how can we expect to get revenue in? How can we expect a client to actually say, yes, this is the right solution for me? We'd just be getting lucky. So that's been the real focus for us. So I find that provocative message sort of like really, really interesting, because that's knowing their clients. That's saying, like, if you want what we've got, you will like consent to this message. And if you don't, like, as you say, we'll see you soon. And actually sometimes like a divisive message is the best message. And that was very much like when we started as a business, that was like, even in the name ThirdWay, was deliberately being slightly divisive to actually draw those lines and really hone in on the clients who bought into what we're about and wanted to work with us. So I think knowing your client, knowing what you've got, really, really having a strategy, that's how you're going to get revenue in.
And that's something that you're relying on at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that it's difficult for our clients at the moment to spend. It's difficult for them to commit. But most of our projects, the average size project is sort of a commitment of around £500,000 of spend. So it's not small spend for companies. So what we're trying to do is actually really help them and have strategies, which is how can you spend a bit less to give you certainty for the future, or as much certainty as you can have, to take a longer term, more strategical approach to delivering our projects as opposed to the normal speed at which we do. And it's solely because we need to answer their problems. Like, we need to actually help them identify them, give them the right solution, then give them the confidence to spend significant amounts of money to enhance their business and increase productivity.
Great. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to turn to some of the questions, and two of them are similar, so I might try to combine them. Are SMEs typically less likely to survive a crisis than larger companies, or is the risk the same? So and the second question was also about that. Is a crisis more challenging for SMEs? And I think in some ways it is, looking back at some of the things we've talked about before, because the individual, especially with really small businesses, because of the things I mentioned before in relation to the fact that the individual owner manager is so caught up in their business, all their energy, all their resources, all their motivations are very much tied into what happens to the business. So if something bad happens to the business, then the individual feels that profoundly, and vice versa. If something happens to the individual, then the effects might reverberate throughout the organization. But also because these smaller businesses, they have fewer resources, so less reserves in place. They're less likely or less able to spread their costs and risks over large product or service lines as opposed to larger businesses. However, having said that, so yes, in some ways, small businesses are more vulnerable. And if you're a business of one, then that is in part your vulnerability, that something happens to you, then is the business able to continue? And I think especially in these times, it's important for individuals like that to maybe reach out and see who else is around doing complementary things, and can you combine forces, at least for a period of time. But I think also there are strengths in being small. So we just had news yesterday in the UK of Boots and John Lewis, a big department store, of them closing down a number of shops and making a number of people redundant across the country. So these larger businesses, can be more at risk in many ways, depending on the sector that they're operating with. Also, Boots had a number of issues sort of going into the crisis as well. But also another thing that makes small businesses perhaps stronger and less vulnerable to a crisis is that they can move, they can change, they can pivot more quickly. They can be more flexible than larger organizations. And because they're less hierarchical in nature, this enables them to be that way. So I think this kind of flexibility is afforded much more in the case of smaller businesses than larger businesses. So So I think that's one thing I would mention. I don't know, Ben, if you want to add to that.
I feel one of the privileges that I have and our business has is that we speak to hundreds of business every single week. And I would say like it kind of falls into three categories. A business of 30 people and below, they've shown to be really, really agile, like the ability to sort of like downsize, to control costs, has been a lot faster than big organizations. And also they have the confidence that when they make a decision to come back to an office or start expenditure again, they can make it quickly and action it within 2 weeks. So I think there are certain advantages for businesses of that size, just how quickly you can move, how quickly you can reduce, how quickly you can grow again. At the other extreme, we found some of our corporate clients, they have an advantage that they typically like have larger cash balances, larger access to funds. So whilst they may be slower in making plans, there isn't perhaps the mass panic about, what's the future of the business going to look like. Perhaps redundancies are inevitable, but so on and so, like they've got the cash to deal with it. I feel really for the businesses between say 50 and 250 people. That's where I almost feel like they can't be agile enough to just really reduce costs, but they don't have as much just free cash and capital to invest in marketing or changing their space or enhancing the training for their staff. And it can be quite a crippling period for businesses of there, just that sense of we want to act, but we can't at both ends. So I would say it's different for different sized businesses and like it's challenging for all, but I feel the SMEs about 50 to 200 people, it's a real challenge at this time.
Thank you. So we're going to have to finish there in the interest of time, but also one of the comments or questions was in relation to, can we watch these sessions, these webinars back? And my answer is yes. And we do hope to post all of our sessions, so this is our 5th, on the ThirdWay YouTube channel in the near future. And everybody who's signed on today will receive some communication in relation to that. So maybe just to finish by saying that it's important to remember that all these things that we've been talking about in relation to containment and in relation to recovery strategies and activities, that again, none of them should be written in stone. These are things that a company should step back and reflect on and think, how are we performing during this time? What can we do differently, if anything? What's working, what's not? And please join us for our next session when we talk about, I'm quite excited about the next one, but I'm excited about all of them, but especially the next one, which looks at the impact of COVID-19 on the workplace. So during this time, we talk about what are the pros and cons exactly in relation to remote working and what are the demands and desires of the workforce as a result, but also is there a need for the office in the future and what might it look like and how can we all transition to this new normal or new abnormal. So thank you very much. And that's it from me.
Thank you guys and see you next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.